right, hello and welcome back to another episode of Hot Wax. This is episode 15. It's taken me a little while to get this episode out. I was doing a little bit of traveling. I was doing a couple of things, and that's why I thought it was a pretty good idea to do this album that we're going to do for episode 15. Also just had a birthday, so I just turned 50. So this is a Timeline album from a Timeline band of mine. And I don't really like repeating bands, but we're going to do it on this one. The album that we're going to do today is, it just came out on Friday the 13th of 2026 on their own record label, Silver Arrow, and I'm talking about none other than the amazing Black Crowes, Chris and Rich Robinson, and their brand new album, A Pound of Feathers. And there's my copy right there. I just received the album on Friday the 13th on the day it came out. So it's, March 31st now, and it's taken me a little while to ingest the album. And now that I have, I thought I would do the Hot Wax, episode 15 on Pound of Feathers. And this is, of course, the title track, Profane Prophecy, off of the record. And I got to tell you, at first blush, when I heard the record, I'd only heard a couple of the singles. And the one thing that kind of struck me is that I only saw Chris and Rich Robinson on the album cover, on the promos. And, it was kind of strange to me because the Black Crowes has always been this amazing, fucking band that I've grown up with. And the amazing musicians that have been in it, that have made some of the greatest music and the greatest albums of my life, up until this point. So the one thing that I noticed about the record is that I didn't, and let me go back and say I really liked the record. And it wasn't, and I listened to it, a couple of singles, and then the day it came out, I really took it in. And it wasn't until I got home and I put the record on that I really kind of started to enjoy the album. But I will say, when I was traveling with my dad, through the Arizona desert, through the mountains, is when I really started to pick up the vibe of this record. So I just want that to be put out there before I give you my opinions and my what I feel about this record. I just want to say I really liked it. You know what I mean? It's a Black Crowes record. It's important in my timeline, turning 50. Each Black Crowes record, when I say a timeline band, we talked about that with the Smashing Pumpkins. Because the Smashing Pumpkins are a timeline. Every album they've put out, the same with the Black Crowes since Shake Your Moneymaker, which we talked about that in one of the earlier episodes. We talked about Shake Your Moneymaker and the effect that album had on me and the effect that album had on the record industry. But with A Pound of Feathers, the first time I heard it, like I said, the first time I saw it, I saw Chris and Rich. And that, I thought, where's Sven? Where's some of these guys in the band? And let's go back real quick. The Black Crowes had kind of broken up and went on a hiatus. Rich and Chris started doing their own music. Chris with the Brotherhood, which I really never got into. It just, for one reason or another, it wasn't my bag. I just couldn't. Neil Cassell and these guys are great. It just, Chris Robinson Brotherhood wasn't my thing. But I really gravitated towards Rich Robinson's solo career. That was something that kind of moved me. Through a Crooked Sun and Flux and Ceaseless Sight and, even Paper before that. And then obviously the stuff that he was doing with Magpie Salute before they got back together. And for all you guys out there, I don't know if you fucking have ever gotten a chance to get into the Magpie Salute, but it's one of the greatest fucking bands I've ever heard. Like, that band, to me, the Magpie Salute, is better than, the albums that they put out, High Water 1 and 2. I know they did the covers album and stuff and some of the Black Crow stuff, but I mean, High Water 1 and 2 and some of the stuff that the Magpie put out, some of it I like better than the modern Black Crows, and I'm talking about 1972, the EP, and Happiness Bastards, and this new album. Now, in Magpie Salute, obviously, Rich had Sven Pippian of the Black Crows and Mark Ford and Eddie Harsh before Eddie passed, so this was kind of like super group. But the original material they writing far supersede. But when the Black Crows, when that band broke up and Chris and Rich decided to put the band back together, as they met with family and they decided to bury the hatchet, they came out with an EP. And they did some things. They toured and they didn't put out any original material, but they put out it was called 1972. And it was an album of covers, which is actually a pretty cool album. But when the Black Crows got back together, and let me reference that again, when Chris and Rich got back together, they decided not to use any original members of the Black Crows from their past. And that meant no Sven at first. So when they first got back together, I was very leery about it. And then when I watched them, to me, it was just, and I hate to use the terms, it was a cover band of a band, but it just seemed like Chris and Rich, which, let me just say I love Rich Robinson, and Chris Robinson's one of my favorite vocalists and lyricists, and Rich is a great lyricist. They're two of my favorite singer-songwriters of all time. Mick and Keith, I put them up there with it. Do you know what I mean? They're incredible. Jimmy Page, Robert Plant, but the Allman Brothers. I mean, there's so many. Chris and Rich write great music. Let's just say that. So when they got back together and they didn't use any of the original bandmates, it was kind of like, it was interesting to me. But it seemed to work on 1972, and then they did Howard Stern. They did a bunch of shit, and I was following it because I love the Black Crows, and there was something about it that, was just disingenuous to me, I guess. But nonetheless, we had the Black Crows back, and I missed Magpie, but I love the Black Crows. So 1972 was cool. They did a bunch of covers, some David Bowie, some Temptations. It was pretty damn good. T-Rex. I mean, I like the fucking record. And then they went out and they celebrated Shake Your Moneymaker, and they were playing with a guitar player, and this is kind of like that 7 Degrees of Separation. They were playing they didn't have anybody from the original Black Crows at first, and they were playing with a guitar player by the name of Isaiah Mitchell. And Isaiah Mitchell and I, kind of have a history together. We kind of go back. My band and his band used to play a lot in Southern California in the garage, psych rock scene in San Diego and such. He was in a band called Earthless, and I was in a band called The Spots. A lot of the times we would cross paths, we'd hang out, we'd get together, and talk about music. So I kind of had a cool relationship with the guy. And he ended up being the lead guitar player of the Black Crows. And he's in a band called Earthless. So I started paying a little bit more attention. And then they kind of, he had to go back to his band. They kind of changed. Remember, Charlie Starr played a little bit from Blackberry Smoke. But they ended up getting Nico back from Magpie Salute that played with Rich and Mark, and he's kind of a Mark Ford disciple. And they came out with a record called Happiness Bastards a couple of years ago, 2 years ago. And I will tell you, I really liked that album because it kind of felt like the Black Crows were starting to make that type of music again. Can I say? That type of music that I would gravitate towards too, and that type of music that when I was a bit younger than I am now, it resonated with me. And then they came out with this record. Now let's go all the way back. Now the Black Crows, let's not fool ourselves. The Black Crows have had a lot of lineup changes throughout the years since I started listening to the band. When Shake Your Moneymaker came out very long ago, and my sister Nicole had sent me a band that hadn't even put out a record yet, and she was living in Carbondale, and I listened to a 5-song demo of the Black Crows. I was immediately blown away. That would eventually become the Shake Your Moneymaker album around 1989, 1990. And, with that album, you had Jeff Sayce and Chuck Leavell. Jeff Chase and Chuck Leavell Chase, of course, on guitar. The rumor has it he didn't play a lot of guitar on the record, but Chuck Leavell was playing keyboards. And Shake Your Moneymaker was a great rock and roll album. Let's just face it, that album kind of brought back a rock and roll revolution for a lot of people my age. And then the lineup change would happen again. Jeff would leave the band, and you would bring in one of my favorite ever Black Crowes, one of my favorite ever guitar players in the world, Mark Ford. And then Eddie Harsh would join the band. But of course, the great Chuck Leavell from Allman Brothers, Rolling Stones, and Eric Clapton fame would make Shake Your Moneymaker a great record. But they could. So Eddie Harsh, longtime, older veteran rock and roll, ended up joining the band. And those albums, with Southern Harmony and Musical Companion, Amorica, and in between then, those unreleased albums that they eventually put out that they did with Mark Ford, the Tall album. And Band, those albums were incredible. And then Three Snakes and One Charm, which that was an album that didn't rock with me, but I love the Crow. And then the band would change again. There would be, from 1996 to 1999, there would be this little hiatus. I think Rich probably put out Paper album with Joe Magestro and those guys. And then after Three Snakes and One Charm, the album By Your Side came out. And I'd like to draw the parallel to this new album, Pound of Feathers, and By Your Side, and I'll tell you why. I'll bring it back all in a minute. By Your Side, Eddie was still in the band, but Mark Ford had left the band, and the original bass player, Johnny Colt, who had been with the band and left the band. The Black Crowes, again, would retool. They would bring on, again, one of the longest tenured members of the Black Crowes, Sven Pippian, and they would bring, and actually, in By Your Side, Richard kind of handled all the guitar work. They would bring a guy on named Audley Freed. And during, in between By Your Side and Lions, the Black Crowes got, of course, together with the great Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin, tying all things together. And they did the Plant and Page stuff, and that was Sven and Audley Freed. But for the most part, Steve Gorman was still playing drums in the band. It was still kind of that core of the Black Crowes. It was still a band when you listen to it. But By Your Side, they kind of changed a little bit. Then they had the Outfalling with Jimmy Page, and I think about 2001 or something like that, they came out with the album Lions, and that was with Audley Freed and Eddie and Steve Gorman, Sven, Chris Rich. But a lot of people always have this controversy that Jimmy Page played a little bit on the album. I think he had a lot to do with the album. You can hear the influences of Jimmy Page on Lions. But then there was a giant hiatus after that, and the band split up. And it seemed indefinitely at that point. Again, the brothers, that's just their thing. And from the time of 2001, 2008, there was no Black Crowes albums. And then 2008, they put the band, but in between that, there was they didn't put out an album. They put out a live record, Freakin' Roll Into the Fog with the Black Crowes. And that was kind of a reunion with Mark Ford. And I got to tell you, those shows were hot as shit. And the set lists were hot as shit. And they kind of re-released Band. They re-released those records, and they got back together with Mark Ford, and they started playing, together again. And those shows were amazing because they were doing Southern Harmony stuff. They were doing, even some of the newer stuff, and they were playing with Mark, and it was great. But then, the shit would hit the fan, and the band would totally disband and go on indefinite hiatus again. And during this time, that's when you got, like I said, Rich Robinson is one of my favorite songwriters and guitar players and producers, and he had put out some great records. But the Black Crowes would come back with War Paint. And it was kind of revitalized, I thought, because Eddie wasn't back in the band, but they still had Sven, and they had a guitar player from the band called the North Mississippi All-Stars. They had Luther Dickinson. And the Black Crowes kind of came back again. Like, I kind of felt like they, started to have an organic feel again, like a relatable feel, like a rock and roll band. It wasn't the Chris and Rich show. And then they would do Before the Frost, Until the Freeze. They'd go out to Levon Helms' bar, and they're still playing with Luther, and they've been playing great shows. I mean, War Paint was great. This album was great. Rich was writing some songs. The Black Crowes are really kind of hitting it. There was kind of that more earthy, and Sven, it was just a great band, Steve Gorman. But that wouldn't last. They would break up again, and that they would do the Crowology, like the live Crows acoustic album, which I thought was really cool. But they wouldn't come out with another album, until the 1972 EP. But during that time, the Black Crowes, like I said, there was some. If you really liked, Chris Robinson Brotherhood, you were really enjoying that. I was listening to the Rich stuff, and that's where the Magpie Salute came in. And Magpie Salute ended up, Rich's solo band was very good if you saw any of those shows. And then he kind of incorporated John Hogg again, and he started the Magpie Salute. And that was an amazing band. It was very organic. The inner working, the guitar play, I guess is what I'm getting at, of Mark and Rich and Sven, and they had a new drummer, Joe Magestro. Eddie was playing with them until he passed, and then it was Matt Slocum. But they had Nico and they had Mark Ford. I mean, Magpie Salute's one of my favorite bands. But when the Black Crowes reunited, I really thought, this time, with the brothers kind of burying in the hatchet and realizing that family and rock and roll and this and that was at the forefront, that's when they started releasing these records. But the one thing about Pound of Feathers that I feel is a lot of people said that it was a return to form. I thought 1972 was kind of cool. I thought the live Shake Your Moneymaker record was great. But Happiness Bastards to me kind of sounded like they were becoming a band again. With everybody that was in the band that they were working with. Nico is just a great guitar player. Sven, I love his bass playing. I'm not too crazy about their drummer and their keyboard player, but they plug and play, and they have the background singers. The band, Chris and Rich, they were all working together. And the shows were great. That's why what kind of changed me about A Pound of Feathers. First of all, when I put on the record, the one thing I could really realize, like I said, there wasn't a full band playing music. Sven is gone. He's not on the record. And this album kind of started out with Chris and Rich working together like they did when they were younger, which that's kind of a cool thing, where Chris Robinson was actually playing drums and Rich was playing guitar. And they were kind of writing these riffs and bouncing, back and forth off each other, which I can relate to. I've done that a lot. But that's where a lot of these songs started coming from. And the producer somehow, from all accounts, had said, "Hey, this is the pure form of the Black Crowes. You guys should, record the record like this." And they eventually brought in a keyboard player and a drummer and the background singers, but the rest of it is all Rich Robinson. He plays the bass, plays all the guitar parts, and Chris, wrote, they wrote the song, the lyrics. Chris wrote the lyrics, and they came up with everything pretty much together as a brotherhood. As brothers. Without any help from anyone else around any direction, which, right or wrong, there's no right or wrong, way to do it. It just, for me, I like it when the Black Crowes have a group of guys and everybody's kind of contributing. This album to me is very edgy. It's very, in a certain ways, it's dark. It's more robotic like AC/DC than it is more flowy like the band or the Allman Brothers, which is cool because, they can do, the Black Crowes can do both. But this album is kind of more, has some feels of Exile on Main Street, has some different feels to it. But, there's just something missing about the record that I was just hanging out with some of the guys from the Mississippi Stranglers, and we all kind of had the same thought about it, that there was something lacking, and I know that I really look into these albums most and more. Most of my friends have listened to it, said, "Boy, the new album is great." They called me, they texted me, "You love the new Crowes?" I love the Crowes. I love the Black Crowes, but it still doesn't mean that there's something missing from this record. But also, something's lost, but something is found. There's an edginess, there's a cocksure attitude, an ass pocket of soul. There's a feeling to this record that had been gone for a little bit. But there's also something missing, which I feel like the rhythm section, the organic flow, the ebb and flow of the album, it's a little bit different from Black Crowes, but it is what it is. But I still kind of feel like this album has some type of staying power. It does have that classic Black Crowes song feel, but there's one thing, there's a couple of things about this record that I feel that it has some staying power. Number one, my 50th birthday, the album came out. It's always going to be a timeline record for that point in my life. So that's always going to stick out for me personally. But also, there was a kind of a cool thing. I was having a conversation about how each one of these songs could have fit on one of their other albums. Like, we're listening to it, and we're like, oh man, that album could have been, that song could have been on Lions, or boy, that song could have been on Southern Harmony, or that kind of has a feel of Shake Your Moneymaker, or War Paint, or you know what I mean. It's like there was a song that could have fit on every record. And I want to say there was nothing wrong with this record. It just, like I said, it is a great rock and roll record. And driving through the mountains across the desert, I really started to feel certain elements of the record that I had missed. Like I said, when I put the record on, there were certain elements that I missed. I do like the fucking record. I think it's a stellar rock and roll record. I just think there's like an organic, rhythmic feel. But I'm sure they're going to sound great live. If anybody's going to see them in Chicago, hit me up. Let me know, man. I'd love to see you. I'm going to see them out here. But yeah, there's definitely like Cruel Streak. I love that song. Queen of the B-Sides. I think that's such a great song. But there was something more AC/DC, like I said, more than the band, about it. But you got some really good acoustic tunes too. You can hear all the influence. You can hear the Zeppelin. You can hear the AC/DC. You can hear the T-Rex. I mean, there's some Mark Bolan influences on here. Some Zeppelin, some Stones. That's what always brought the Black Crowes to us, because they sounded like these bands, but they were our band. They still are. And that's what kind of like this record also signified to me, that it was such a great rock and roll record that it's like, oh yeah, it's right in the wheelhouse of my time. It's a fantastic record. But like I said, personally for me, as much as I love this record, it's like that, Eros Blues, the last song, Doomsday Dog. I mean, I love the record. It's just, to me, there was something about it that, as a Black Crowes fan, obviously I'm overjoyed to get a Chris and Rich record. But they can't call it Brothers of a Feather. They can't market it like that, so they market it as the Black Crowes. But this is a Chris and Rich Robinson album. But again, they are the fucking Black Crowes. So it's, being subjective about it, but also realizing that it is a great record. I'm hard to please when it comes to bands that I love. But like I said, man, there's something about sitting in a room and having this organic jam session with all these guys and writing these songs and everybody having a part rather than just the two of you. And again, there's nothing wrong with that if the two of you are amazing. There's something, like I said, about this album that I miss, about the organic flow of it. And I'm sure that's going to come back. This is, the Black Crowes are going to have, quite a few more records. And this is going to be one of them that is going to be up there, kind of like everyone says, return to form. But I just think it's such a great record, in any time. It's got that AC/DC. But anyways, I do think that any Black Crowes fan should go out and listen to this record, because it's not a bad record, and it's going to be an important record in the annals of their time. When you listen to it, there's an element of, like I said, there's an element of rock and roll. There's an element of, like I said, when I saw the first video, it's very, dark, but I only saw Chris and Rich. It was just weird. But, there's this element rawness, of punk rock, of reckless abandon, the devil may care attitude. This album is a hip pocket of soul. It is a scorcher, and it is a rock and roll record in all terms. Just I know that these guys can do better, even though this album's great. So it's been a pleasure to have you back on Hot Wax. This is episode 15, and my birthday episode. Woohoo! So it's been a good one, and with a pound of feathers, it's been a good review of this, because I've been really going down the rabbit hole of this record since it came out. So that's why I feel with it fresh and a lot of Black Crowes and everything going on, it would be a good album. So, but Profane Prophecy and Pharmacy Chronicles, all those songs, give it a listen. It's a good record. I highly suggest it. And you probably, like I said, if you're going to be at the show, hit me up. Hope you guys had just about as much fun as I did with episode 15 with the new Black Crowes release, A Pound of Feathers. And hope you go out and get it, or just Spotify, take a listen to it, man. It's a good record. Look forward to coming back next month with a new album and a new perspective. Being 50 years old, it's a whole new trip, man. Somebody that most people didn't expect to make it past 27. I guess I've been living on bonus time since then, and now 50. Feel as good as I can, man. It was good to see a lot of you this weekend at the party at the brewery. It's good to be back together with the old band and friends and family. I couldn't tell you more how I appreciated that party. It was amazing, and I love you guys all. Thanks for tuning in to Hot Wax for another episode. We'll see you again next month. And for God's sakes, spend what you love and love what you spend. This has been Hot Wax, and I'm Kurt Finn. We'll see you.